welcome everyone. This is Russ Sitka from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Russ is a lead designer and developer of interactive experiences in the Future Projects Division at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. His work incorporates multidisciplinary, creative and technology skills to prototype new experiences, research new techniques and technologies, and explore possibilities to enhance how history is felt, understood and transmitted. I think the Future Projects Division is, to me, I think one of the most fascinating departments in Holocaust memorialization in the world, because you have this space in your museum to just play and experiment with no kind of assumption that you have to always get things out. So we'll talk about this a bit more this afternoon in the games panel as well, but thank you very much, Russ and Sylvina, for joining us, and thank you.
Great, thank you, Vicky, and thank you all for being here. So we'll go into a little bit of that whole future projects thing to kick things off. But first, I want to just give you guys a sense of just what we're going to go over here today. We're going to just talk about who am I, what's future projects, what is Inquest really, content and inspiration for Inquest. We'll talk about curiosity and this kind of metaphor of the bridge that I've presented. What have we learned so far from the project, and what's next? So, as Vicky said, I'm Russ Sitka. I have a background in fine arts and digital multimedia design. Like many art majors, I ended up in a job that was not related to art originally. So I did web development, and eventually that led me to USHMM in 2010. And I started working with the Future Projects Division in 2015, which was kind of around the time that it was forming to begin with. It didn't exist when I first joined the museum. I have some prior experience with building prototypes of digital and board games, and I like tinkering with music, a good bike ride, and treading lightly on the planet, in case you need some conversation starters later on. So I wanted to just briefly show some other work, just so you can understand that we do more than games, although games have definitely come up in our past work, and these are all projects that I worked on. So starting from the upper left, we have a light-based data visualization that was taking the liquidation era of the Łódź ghetto and animating it in lights. This was hanging from the ceiling in one of our experimental spaces in the museum for about a month that we tested. In the center, you can see this is the captain's hat from the St. Louis, part of our collection. This, along with 4 other objects, we did some very preliminary 3D scanning tests where we just put a green screen behind it and rotated it around and took photos and then put it together in some software to turn it into a 3D model. And that is an avenue that's being explored a little more properly from some other folks in the museum now. But that was like our first time trying it. And then on the upper right, this is a board game prototype called Exodus. It was inspired by our Americans in the Holocaust special exhibition that talks about different factors of the American perspective on the history. And this was kind of a board game meant to simulate the sort of anxious collecting of documents in an emigration scenario where you're trying to leave a sort of fictional country, and it's about kind of feeling the tension of uncertainty and how things change over time. In the bottom left-hand corner is probably the most mysterious picture, but it's actually a three-dimensional spatial audio experiment we did where we had a bunch of speakers in a room playing survivor testimony and a 3D tracking camera that was tracking anybody who was in that space. And so when you would move around, you would hear different voices, and we were experimenting with how does proximity and movement affect the sense of presence when you're hearing a testimony. And then in the bottom right, we have a project that we did with one of our museum fellows who was a musicologist studying how music was used militaristically in the camps, specifically in Auschwitz I. We happened to receive a donation of an Auschwitz I 3D model that we were able to actually use for this project. So we put it into some software and we made some interactive elements, some 3D walkthroughs, and it was a really interesting project. And actually the probably first one that we did in the same platform that the project I'm sharing today will use. So a little bit about future projects really quick. We're a small digital innovation team at the museum, and by small, I mean me and the two lovely women sitting right in the center of the room there, not to put any spotlights on you, but there you go. It's just us three. And we set a lot of our own priorities. We, of course, are guided by the institution's priorities first and foremost, but we don't have anybody really from the top down telling us, here's what you work on next. We're pretty self-determined in that way. Even though things from the outside do come in occasionally, we are primarily self-determined. So we explore and test new ideas and technologies. We experiment with new education and engagement opportunities. And our mission is to, enable continued innovative growth for the museum. We joke a lot about museum time and how that moves a lot slower than normal time. And we try to move a little faster than museum time, but we're still sort of museum-y in our pacing sometimes. So we work across our institutions. So, we will reach out to folks in all manner of divisions, both to raise awareness, spark ideas, and share learnings. And our testing processes vary in formality. I know there's definitely a lot of projects that I've seen so far at the Expo that have, focus group testing and these things. And we haven't gotten quite to that level of formality yet. It kind of has varied from project to project, and we were very informal early on. But that is something that we are building upon. And I just wanted to close out by talking about our dinosaur egg analogy, which is a whimsical sort of idea that our former director came up with to talk about, what exactly it is we are delivering. Because when you aren't necessarily delivering a finished product, you're not saying okay, everything we do, we're going to finish in some produced way. What exactly are you delivering? Well, we are primarily learning oriented, and we tend to think of it as, we're incubating this dinosaur egg. But eventually somebody's going to have to adopt that dinosaur egg for it to kind of grow into a healthy dinosaur. So that is kind of what makes us a little bit different, in that we have had a few projects that have matured to that dinosaur stage. But for the most part, that's because we found somebody in our museum who could become the owner of that particular piece. And that can be a little tricky sometimes because our colleagues are very busy. They're in the museum time, full time, working on our exhibitions, working on our web products and things like that. And so it is always an interesting experience to look through that. So on to Inquest. How to think about Inquest is, this is an internal prototype conceived and made by one person. That's me. The museum is quite large. It's over 400 staff members. And I'm here representing the museum, but this was a very self-started project, and has been pretty much primarily driven by me. So if there's anything about it that seems off, you can just blame me. But it's more of a curiosity builder than an interactive lesson, which is not to say that every Holocaust game besides this is an interactive lesson, but I've read a fair amount in game design for educational literature, and a lot of it is very emphatic on kind of the learning goals, and those are of course important, but I think that thinking about how an experience builds sort of a lingering curiosity is always much more interesting to me than can they walk away with this lesson's worth of knowledge, and can they answer these basic questions. And this particular experience is for people who know the basics of the Holocaust, but it's otherwise pretty self-contained. We will be doing some testing with younger audiences in the future that I think that particular statement will be put to the test with, because I have tried to keep the reading and writing, or the reading in the game, to a minimum, but inevitably you do have to set the context somehow. And as I said before, full production plans for this particular thing are not assumed, but we're always curious about where these things could lead, but it's just not assumed. So the story premise, it's a little more sci-fi maybe than some other things you've seen so far, but in the future, humanity's most important memories and lessons are stored in a vault, kind of like the Svalbard seed vault, if you're familiar with that. And then on the annual Day of Remembering, they broadcast memories directly into the minds of everyone on Earth so they aren't forgotten. What could possibly go wrong? Mere hours before the annual broadcast, the vault is breached and data corrupted by an unknown force. The broadcast can't be stopped, so it's up to you to go in and reconnect and repair the damaged memories before everyone on Earth receives a corrupted transmission. So small stakes. So this, I'm going to go through a couple of these slides a little quickly. They're just sort of describing the general gameplay loop of the experience. So it combines exploration and puzzle solving in a fictional dreamlike setting, which is a very convenient way of saying I used a lot of very basic shapes because building environments in 3D is quite time consuming. So in the game, players are tasked with repairing damage to the world memory vault, as mentioned before, from a breach by an unknown force. Players collect hidden memories relating to Holocaust history and use their notebook to reconnect and repair them. This is the notebook, as you can see. Players use a focus ability as a radar to locate the hidden memories in the environment. As players follow the audio and visual cues, they can reveal the hidden memories. The memories include events, recurring phenomena, and other factors that shaped the history. Provenance, which is the little book character avatar thing you can see here, is a character that guides the player and describes the contents of each memory. Once located, each memory is added to your notebook where the player figures out how they connect to each other via this little diagram you can see kind of on the left. Sometimes you encounter a distorted memory, which are red, and they must be repaired before they can be used. In these distorted memories, the attacker overwrote parts of the description that you must find. And the player uncovers those distorted pieces of the text by using a magnifying glass, and they kind of hover over the individual letters until they've found the entire sort of distortion, and they repair the memory before collecting it. And then by taking those collected memories and dropping them in the correct sequence, the next section is revealed. So in this screenshot, you can see the leftmost column is darkened and the rightmost column has been lit up, and the player will proceed further and find more things. So that is the loop of the game. Content and inspiration. So some basic design goals here were to explore themes of Holocaust memory and distortion through a holistic perspective. I feel like a lot of games that I've seen overall very logically and intelligently zoom in on really specific personal stories or very specific moments in the history, whereas this takes kind of a much broader holistic approach, more of almost a systems thinking style approach to looking at the history at a very high level. And that is partially informed by the content, which we'll get to in a moment, but that I think is what makes that a little bit unique. I wanted to provide tactile engagement. Obviously most games are kind of tactile, so that seems kind of redundant, but I really like to move around in games, and whenever I can't move around, I get really fussy. So I knew that there was going to be a puzzle element where there'd be like clicking and dragging and pointing, and that wasn't going to give me that kind of tactile satisfaction that I wanted. So having an environment to explore and actually physically moving with direct input was a way to do that. And to give the player confidence, but not too much confidence. We want the player to feel like they're starting to understand what this is and how different factors came together to cause these different events. But we obviously don't want them to think, oh, well, I know it all now. I've studied Holocaust history because I played Inquest. And of course, we want to create more questions and spark curiosity. So on the spectrum of Holocaust history games, a highly, highly simplified spectrum, but just to kind of put it somewhere between realism and fantasy, on the realism side, I have The Last Scene project, which to me is like the epitome of realism in Holocaust games that I've seen. And then on the fantasy side of the spectrum, I've put My Memory of Us because it's like very evocative and creative and fantastical in certain ways, while still having some connection to the history. And I would, and Darkest Files I've kind of put in the center because it's kind of a combination of those two things. It's heavily stylized, but it's also very grounded in documentation and that kind of thinking. And so I put Inquest a little bit towards the right. Maybe it should be even further over towards fantasy, really. But it's definitely to the right of the center in this particular graph. So the content, funny story about the content, I really actually didn't know where I was going to source the content. The concept for the game came first, and then I thought, oh, well, it's going to be really hard to populate this game with content if I don't have something existing to go on. And art historians, of course, are available and helpful, but very busy, so I'm always very reluctant to go bother them. So I started looking around on Goodreads for books that had the kind of format I was looking for, and I came across Peter Hayes' Why Explaining the Holocaust, which apparently we already give to teachers at our teacher conference, and I had no idea. And so I thought I had just discovered this out of the blue, but we actually had it all along. So the first chapter of the book was what I used as the basis for content for this prototype, which actually doesn't cover as much of the Holocaust as it does the history of anti-Semitism. So that is definitely something that you would probably notice if you have a chance to try it out, is just that it's hitting that first chapter, and the history goes back way further than Holocaust history because it's explaining a lot more of the history of anti-Semitism specifically. And so the content went from the book to writing a script in Google Docs to using a tool called Inky, which is basically a third-party open source tool that makes it easier to integrate dialogue into a game. It's compatible with Unity and with some other things, and Unity, of course, is the game engine software that I used for this particular project, and that is where most of the action happened. So I'll talk about some inspiration, some other games that inspired this design, the first of which is called The Case of the Golden Idol. This came out only a few years ago. It is a kind of murder mystery observation and deduction game where you basically find words in this kind of explorable environment, and they become objects that you use to plug in a kind of fill-in-the-blank style to sort of reverse engineer what was happening in this scene, because there's all sorts of strange things that are happening in kind of like a looping freeze frame kind of style, and you're trying to make sense of what you're seeing and picking up these words along the way. If you haven't tried it, I highly recommend it if you like thinky games. Another game that I took inspiration from is called Chants of Sonar, which takes place in a kind of Tower of Babel-esque setting where you're this wandering translator who's moving through different communities in the tower that speak different languages and translating the different characters that you come across. And so you can kind of see in this screenshot here where you have these symbols that are kind of on the right, and those are basically all the symbols you've uncovered so far. And then on the left you have this notebook, and it has these pictographs that basically describe what that symbol represents. And at first you don't see what the symbol represents. It's your job to take symbols from your inventory and apply them to the pictures, and that basically translates them. And that's how you kind of learn the language over time. And that seemed like a really interesting way of kind of synthesizing information. And then for environment design, even though that was kind of a bit more rushed, That Dragon Cancer is a game that is exploring very difficult subject matter. It was made by a pair of parents who had a terminally ill son who had a cancer diagnosis, and the game takes place in these beautiful kind of abstract settings that are kind of juxtaposing scenes from their family life with different kind of surreal landscapes as you're hearing them talk about the experience and reflecting on it. So in doing this, we're kind of breaking our own museum learning guidelines a little bit. It states specifically, and I'm sure this is something that appears in many places, but the history shouldn't be simplified to make it oversimplified. However, games by their very natures tend to simplify complex things to make them accessible. Otherwise, you're pretty much talking about a simulation, which is a whole other beast. So when I think of how a game simplifies things, I just tend to think that the game isn't the final word. There's more beyond the game to discover. We can't expect any game to provide every layer of nuance and every possible detail. And I think there's also ways to prime people during or after the experience to kind of set their expectations for what exactly they're going to see. And I'm going to take a little sip here, just a minute.
Is it interactive, the presentation, or you want to wait with questions till the end?
Questions to the end, if that's okay. Thank
It's
you.
not the game.
Oh, no, I'm not going to be demonstrating. But if you'd like to try it out, please let me know at the end. Who here knows about Guitar Hero? Who has played or heard about it? Okay, excellent. So when I was almost graduating college student, I was a enjoyer of Guitar Hero, but I didn't actually like guitar music, and I wasn't really interested in the instrument. But I bring this up because it was something that literally changed my life and how I spend my time in a pretty significant way. And not that I'm like a professional musician or anything now, but basically I've been playing guitar in some form since I played Guitar Hero in 2006. And that comes from somebody who had no interest in guitar music or guitar, and guitar is such a pain in the butt that it takes a real something to make that happen. And I just think it's an interesting yet anecdotal kind of case study of what does it do and not do? Well, it connects you with the essence and energy of the music. It allows you to play an immersive role with an abstracted but similar interface. To go back a bit, the guitar that you're playing has 5 colored buttons, no strings, and just a goofy little paddle to simulate strumming. And that's it. But somehow it creates a connection that for me was not there. It makes this difficult task of playing guitar approachable, and it builds confidence and interest in the subject. I started listening to new music because of Guitar Hero. But what it doesn't do, it doesn't teach you music theory, it doesn't teach you history. It doesn't force you to face the full complexity right away. In fact, it doesn't even really ever get to the full complexity just because of the simplicity of the controller. And it doesn't give you any particular skills that transfer directly to an instrument, besides like some rhythm, some motor skills, but there's so much more that goes on in guitar that the game couldn't possibly cover. But what's also kind of interesting is there have been other games that kind of followed up on that concept, and they took it a step further. So Rocksmith is a game that used an actual guitar. You plugged it in, and you had software that would do pitch detection and determine what you were playing. But otherwise, the actual game part was pretty similar, but it was actually pushing you closer to I'm actually playing the guitar now. And I think actually at the highest difficulty levels, you would be literally playing the song. So, it's anecdotal. I don't think I'm the only one who's had this experience. I've actually had a few instances of guitar players I enjoyed mentioning in an interview, oh yeah, I played Guitar Hero when I was a kid, and that is what turned me around. So I was like, oh wow, okay. It turned that ambivalence into curiosity and lifelong interest. And, I think interactive approaches are a really important tool for sustaining relevance and building that curiosity bridge. And granted, playing guitar is a lot more exciting than Holocaust history. We can, I think, agree that there is definitely like a different kind of appeal there. But nonetheless, it does demonstrate the power of games, I think, in a really compelling way to do that. So what have we learned so far? So we're a little bit early in the learning journey, but we have done a few things. We had a test with a small group of staff, and I made several changes for a second iteration. Some of the gameplay elements that I mentioned, like the distortions and the radar kind of focus mechanic, that was not in the first iteration. It was literally just grabbing these little memory orbs and then putting them in the right spots in the notebook. So adding a bit more sophistication to the gameplay itself was something that felt important. And also adjusting the difficulty level was something we had to work on, because when you're building a prototype, you really don't want it to be too hard. It's okay for it to be too easy, because the worst thing is when you're showing your colleagues and they just throw their hands up and say, I'm just not good at these. And you don't want that. So our plans in the future, actually later this summer, is to test with a group of, we have a student ambassador program. So we take high school and college age students and we bring them in and they do classes and activities. And it's also kind of a pipeline into working for the museum. It's a great program, and they're all really smart kids. And they come in every summer and they help do things, and sometimes we can help recruit them for testing out projects we're working on. So we're excited to be able to do that probably in August, to have probably about 24 or so kids trying this out and getting their feedback, because that's going to be really important, because our staff are not the absolute target audience. Although I like to think of this as, obviously youth is always going to be a very important audience, but I try to think of more of a general audience mindset, to not brick wall anybody from thinking, oh, this isn't for me. And perhaps later on, working with a classroom or museum visitors is a possibility, but that's like pretty far out at the moment. So questions we asked people when we were testing were, the first one was kind of awkward because we were talking with staff. This will make more sense, I think, when we start working with other audiences with testing. But we asked them, how it might have made them more curious. One thing I learned was asking that question point blank is probably not the most effective thing. It's probably a question that's better to be kind of like asked in a sort of roundabout way and just saying like, were there any things that caught your attention or something like that? But if you just ask them straight out, do you feel more curious? It doesn't always get the answer you would probably hope for. Did they learn anything new? Actually, a lot of our staff members learned new things, which I thought was pretty cool. And where were they bored or confused? What would they change? So what we learned from staff testing particularly was that the puzzle design needed to be carefully calibrated to avoid extreme difficulty. I feel like maybe one person on staff told me specifically that they actually got to the end. There were essentially 11 different memories, and at first the entire sort of diagram was available and you got everything out of order. So you had to make sense of 11 different pieces of information and put them in the right spots. And even our staff couldn't figure that out. And I knew that was going to be kind of something we would have to figure out as we went. So what we ended up doing was breaking the puzzles into smaller chunks. And that made the number of variables much more manageable for people. Or at least in theory, that still needs to be tested more, but it is definitely a lot easier now and more approachable. Some players had trouble with 3D navigation. This is a first-person game. Obviously, for younger players who've grown up on things like Minecraft and Fortnite, they're not going to have any problem with this. But as I said, I think inclusivity is important, and first-person navigation can be a little tricky. So I tried to make it as simple as possible, but sometimes it's also environmental design that factors into that. There's a few sections where you have to kind of navigate a narrow section and you might fall off and have to do it again. And so that caused a few people who were less experienced some trouble. Most testers learned something new, as I said, and the exploration and puzzle elements needed a bit more integration to create a cohesive experience. And that's just the nature of a prototype, is we didn't really have the time to sprinkle pieces of environmental storytelling or lore to tell more about the story behind like what you're doing in the game. And you really kind of just get the story premise up front and then you kind of roll with it. But that is something that was commented on a few times. So lessons I learned from making the prototype were, first of all, that ideas can't be scheduled. There's a lot of talk in the kind of creativity literature about, brainstorming techniques, and you sit down and you just like for an hour, you just blast out all your best ideas. And that can work, definitely not off the table. But I found that when you're working with a hard topic in a hard medium, sometimes you just get stuck and you just cannot think your way through it in a block of time that's scheduled. And I have the privilege of working in a role where I can have that time. So I was able to ideate at my own pace because, boy, was it hard to get to something that looked like a game. Because originally it was meant to be like an interactive cloud of questions before it was even a game. And then I had to get from there to here and find different mechanics that weren't completely disastrous. So moving out of realistic environments and situations created the creative space for me to really function at all. I feel like if I had tried to situate this in the history, it would have been nearly impossible to move forward. and that might just be a limitation of my own creativity, because I'm coming at this from a person who has worked at the Holocaust Museum for 15 years, but who has played games for 35 years. So, my mental grammar is definitely more, I guess, in what you would call the mainstream kind of gaming perception. So every detail has risks, and that's kind of relating to the first question when you're, blue sky thinking, what can we do? There were several times where I made different decisions that I thought were completely innocuous. I thought they were just interesting game design choices that ended up being really not appropriate after some additional examination. For example, there is a kind of big pillar in the center of the environment of the prototype. You're kind of like falling down this large pit as you're kind of finding the different memories, and there's this big pillar, and you're seeing like information popping up on the pillar as you go down. And the idea was at the end of the level, after you've done all this kind of thinky work, that it'd be really exciting to be shot up into the sky, and you'd fly through the clouds, and you'd maybe see some kind of reflection text or something as just like a palate cleanser before you move into the next area. But after testing that a few times, I realized it's kind of like a hollow cylinder that you're kind of like walking into at the end, and then you just kind of float up. And after a while I thought, this kind of feels like a chimney. And then I was like, actually, this feels like a incinerator chimney. And I was like, okay, delete, undo. That was not what I intended. I'm glad I caught that one before any of my colleagues saw it. But that was an example of something that I thought was completely innocuous, but because these things don't instinctively come to me at every time that I'm thinking of them, they can be surprising. And finally, the initial technology decisions can have pretty broad-reaching scope implications. I felt pretty comfortable saying, we're going to have some 3D in this game. It's going to give some variety from the kind of flatter puzzle experience. But 3D does really increase the scope of a project, and it makes so much sense in so many cases. But I'm not really sure that this game actually needed the 3D component that it has with how the gameplay has evolved. And that had some definite scope implications. So what is next? So as I said, the scope of the original idea was pretty large, and a little bit too large for our museum does not have prior official digital game experience. If you attend the panel this afternoon, you'll maybe hear a little bit more about our other kind of game-like experiments that we've done. But we've never done a digital game properly, certainly not fully built in-house like this. So it's a big bite. Anybody who knows about game development knows that this is a multi-year process, and it can be very resource intensive, very budget intensive to do something when your example of inspiration comes from the commercial industry with teams of dozens of people who have like a lot of resources and a lot of experience. I am somebody who came into this with relatively modest experience in almost every area. I'm very much a generalist, but I knew just enough about programming, just enough about game engines, just enough about sound design, just enough about writing and that kind of stuff. And what I didn't know, I was able to figure out as I went. I didn't really give a project timeline here, but the concept development took about a month or two, and building the first version took about 3 months of pretty focused work. And that was like probably 50% me looking up how to do X in Unity, because that is just something that takes a lot of time. So 2D might make more sense than 3D for the exploration. Obviously 3D is very compelling, but it also comes with a cost, and we're not really doing anything that uses perspective or the spatial kind of elements. It's not offensive in any way for it to be in 3D, but you just have to do so much more. 3D modeling is just a much more involved process. So if we're thinking about how do we scale this idea to something reasonable, maybe rethinking the 3D gameplay as 2D might be a better fit. We have a permanent exhibition update coming up, quite significant one, and our permanent exhibition will be closed starting at the end of 2026 for 2 years. And we're thinking that might be an opportunity to do some experiments like this. Maybe we can have a little installation, possibly, but that's very theoretical. There might be other things being planned that would make that kind of difficult to do. Alternatively, I think we can take any aspect of these kinds of prototypes and just use it to enhance other things that we're doing. I tend to think of any project that I work on not just as a whole package, but as a collection of elements, kind of an atomic way of thinking, because sometimes you might have something that on the whole is okay, but it's got this one really good idea, and that maybe that could live somewhere else more effectively than what you originally put it in. So just kind of being flexible about where those things are going. I am almost on the slides here, I promise. So I wanted to just briefly touch on institutional risk. That's something that we definitely think about, especially because we don't really do a lot of stuff in the games space. And again, I'm coming to you today on behalf of the museum, but most of our institution doesn't even know we're doing this project because this is a tiny division, and we are part of a smaller division of the overall structure of our institution. So doing things internally for experimentation versus a production for the public, very different things. Very different levels of approval and scrutiny and questioning and all the things, because our authority and our reputation are one of our highest priorities. So we have to be careful about what we do, because it's kind of like our social media policy too. We typically, that team is very much like, we speak up in a way where we are selective about when we speak up, and we do it very carefully because we want it to matter. And games about the Holocaust are still not without controversy. I think obviously this expo has proven, if you've caught any of the wonderful things in the arcade or any of the other discussions, that it's definitely come a long way in the last 10 years, but there's still a lot of unpacking left to do. And I often think about, how would we gauge the risk of producing a project like this? It is one where we have to make sure that our donors aren't alarmed, that our colleagues aren't alarmed. There's a pretty complex structure, and like I said, we're a pretty big institution, so something that we can spin up very quickly, which is like the whole point of our division, is the fact that we don't have to go through the different levels of approval and bureaucracy to just try things out, which is what we're doing here. So I wanted to wrap up by just in case you're curious about any of the games that I mentioned here, and in case these slides get shared, or if you just want to take a picture, these are just URLs to these different projects, all well worth checking out. And with that, I would love to take your questions.
Just to say, the last scene and the Darkest Files are both in the arcade downstairs as well, and they'll be on the panel with you guys later today. Any questions for us? No, it's early, and I know some of you are very
9 a.m.
9 a.m. Yes, there's energy speaking.
Just out of curiosity, how long does the current gameplay loop take if you, like, after you said you simplified it, right? Mm-hmm. So how long would it be just like that? I
would average it at about 20 minutes, but that's probably based on my own playing, which is probably a little bit fast. Mm-hmm. And I added, actually the things that were added in the second version made the game slightly longer, so probably about 20-25 minutes or so.
Hi. Yeah. Oh, I really like your idea. I don't know if it was in place from the beginning, but I like the idea of focusing on Holocaust distortion, which is a very huge topic, but it's very difficult to be addressed in the classroom in general and in games specifically. So I was wondering if you could consider to be more focused on this topic in your future projects. For example, take into consideration the IRA working definition of Holocaust distortion and the different types of Holocaust distortion as they were identified by the IRA, or do you think that it could not be an appropriate topic for a game? What do you think?
Well, it's interesting. The mechanic that I added to this version, which I only really finished testing a few weeks ago, so it was very moment of the hour. So it kind of came to me later. It was one of those things that when I was just trying to get a functioning concept, I was only really able to get together, okay, 3D environment and puzzle pieces that you put together, and it's all high level. And then eventually I thought, well, this needs a little bit more to it. And somehow I got to distortion. But actually the mechanic that is in the current prototype, I will go back to that slide. I guess this is probably the best one. So it has you highlighting the text that has been altered by this kind of bad actor. But actually, originally, I had wanted to make them a little bit more, so actually when you select all of a particular distortion, it turns a different color and you can click it and you hear this like shattering sound. And then Provenance, the character at the top, will kind of reflect on what that particular distortion was doing a little bit. So you're getting a little bit of Holocaust distortion insight. Obviously, these distortions were just sort of, all the text here is essentially me trying to simplify what I gathered from the book inspiration. And then the distortions were me basically intentionally changing the text to mean something different so that I could work with it in the game. But I was thinking about it in terms of different kinds of distortion originally. I actually kind of wanted to have glass-themed mini games that you could play, because I was just thinking about the material nature of glass and how it can distort things if it's in a certain shape, and it can fracture things when it's broken, and how that could be like a really interesting and tactile way of playing with the idea of distortion. But it was just one of those things that was like, whoa, this is a lot of extra work. But it would have been, I think, a nice step towards being able to be more specific about kinds of distortions and like how they work. You know, things like are you just kind of like massaging the facts a little bit? Are you making stuff up completely? Are you, scapegoating? Like what kinds of things you're doing? But yeah, I have been really happy with at least the first step in bringing that in, because like you said, I think it is an important thing, and you don't really see it in games that much. And this is really, really rudimentary, but I think it's a good step forward. But yeah, thank you for your question. I appreciate it.
Are you aiming at a certain age group with this game, or?
Sure, yeah. We are kind of always oriented towards the young adult or emerging adult audience, which is, it can be, I think, from teenagers to young adults. But I was saying earlier in the talk that we try to keep a fairly broad age group compatibility while making sure that we are prioritizing the younger audiences. I think the absolute youngest audiences, this might be a little too advanced for, because it doesn't presume too much knowledge of the Holocaust. But if you're maybe a 9-year-old and you have only heard about this in passing and maybe you don't really even know the basics, it's going to be probably a little too much for them. So it definitely is something that I would probably expect that you would already have had some educational introduction to the history. So I don't really know when that typically starts for most kids. I'm trying to think back to my own experience. It probably wasn't until I was maybe 12 or 13 or so. So that might be around the starting age group, I think. Yeah.
I was just wondering, because the first test of your game was amongst your colleagues,
yes,
who were probably not the youngest age.
True.
Group.
Yes.
So probably maybe change something there.
Yes.
And after that, you have this test with the younger age.
Indeed. Yeah, they were the closest warm bodies we had, and the most eager to test it. But you're right. Yeah. And that is something that we'll be doing later this summer with our ambassador group, because they're definitely in the sweet spot range for us. We actually did, one of my colleagues had their daughter test it, but that's like one person. But she liked it, so that's something. I mean, she probably hears a lot more about Holocaust history because her dad works for the museum, but yeah, thank you. I saw your hand up there.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could say a bit about how long you think the kind of lifespan is of a game like this, because like Ava was saying in her keynote, the internet moves on so quickly, and it takes so much work to make something like this, and you are able to do that because you have a permanent post and you can devote yourself to it. But for like my group's working on a bit of a shoestring, and you were saying that ideas can't be scheduled, but we're constantly trying to like get that funding deadline, get that funding,
True.
and it's just exhausting. So like, what do you think is the kind of lifespan of a project like this? How long is it gonna be something you want your institution to have? How long do you have to change it?
That's a great question. It's like you said, our museum has experienced plenty of like internal technological change too. And actually, if you look at the history of games preservation, it's a pretty fraught space in terms of how, a lot of it is corporate entities interfering with and preventing the archiving of older projects. So there's definitely kind of like a profit interference thing happening there, but not really as big of a deal for us. But I think it's something where if you were committing to building this out into a produced product, then you would have to really determine upfront what your lifespan is. I'm not even really sure what a appropriate number to give. Would 5 years be realistic? Would 10 years be realistic? I think anything beyond that, and things will have changed so much that you are either going to have to somehow take the essence of what this is doing and import it into a new technology, or you might be able to use some kind of archival tool. But it is definitely a really good point. The idea that, we may have a tiny team and it may have just been me working on this, but I also had the luxury of time and not the pressure of funding and things like that. And so I think actually the best way to think about any game project, because it's such a big commitment, is trying to think small. I think it's really easy to think big because everything you see in the world of games is so like technologically impressive. I think, especially if you pay attention to the mainstream industry where there's multi-million-dollar productions, Hollywood level everything. But these are built by teams of hundreds and thousands of people. There's no way we could ever reach that point. The tools have gotten really impressive, so you can do a lot with a little, but I think that there is definitely thinking smaller, I think, makes projects live longer. I think if you want the most state-of-the-art 3D graphics and you want to do everything in like the most graphics card poundingly intensive way, that's going to immediately shorten the lifespan of the project. Meanwhile, you can go look at old web games built in Adobe Flash that have been ported and preserved because they're just dorky little 2D games, and they still work. I mean, Flash is long gone, obviously, but people have found ways to preserve it and port it and make it live on. And because it wasn't some crazy 3D thing using some really weird proprietary stuff, I think it was just more preservation friendly, I guess. So I don't think what this is right now is preservation friendly, but that's kind of what I was hinting at when I'm thinking maybe 2D instead of 3D. That might help kind of ease some of those growing pains or preserving pains and things like that. Because even though it's very tempting to look at all the spectacular things that 3D technology can do and realistic things can do, in the end, that's not what people play games for. Like Minecraft is a perfect example. The game it looks absolutely archaic, and yet it's the most popular game of all time. That means something. And the fact that kids can see beyond it too. Kids are not demanding hyper-realism, even though that realism can be helpful if you are trying to do things historically representing them. There are certainly use cases to be made, but I think if you're working on like a really tough constraint, going as simple as possible is, I think, a really great way to go. But thank you.
Ross, can I look?
Sure.
Just a quick introduction, because one of the things we're doing at the interviews and walkthroughs we're recording is trying to, as I said yesterday, kind of create some frameworks of good practice, etc., from those, so people who don't have time to look at the content can read them. And one of the things that always comes like top of my list for that document is around thinking about these outputs like games as like traveling exhibitions. The game will change. You might have a Flash, and then you have something else, Steam, whatever. But keeping safe and carefully looked after the digitized assets, because everything you digitize or make, that is like digitally born, keep that stuff, you know where it is, back it up, have it in the most stable format that you can have. And many of those formats are really stable, like JPEG at the moment, it's been a stable format for a long time. A PDF everything, that's quite a stable format.
PDF puzzle
don't,
game.
Don't flash it. Maybe not PDF puzzle game. But but the actual individual, so it's not the game that you need to preserve, it's all the assets, because if you've done them once, then you don't make a game, you can make an exhibition out of them, you can put them in a VR experience, and so you can move, and every time you make something, you put some more assets, and then you have this archive of your digital born stuff that you can then move around and port into different contents. And at the moment, a lot of what we're seeing is people are digitizing or making new, totally different things for every digital thing they do, which costs so much more money. And then that old stuff that was digital is like, no one's really sure where it is, it's on some file somewhere. And that's something that's come up a lot in our interviews. Angela.
I was going to suggest, I'm from Scotland, which you can probably tell from the accent, that you might want to kind of speak to one of the universities. And so we've collaborated with my old university, and two of our games are downstairs, and one costs nothing, and the other one was kind of minimal cost. So you'll find that they are teaching gaming students, and you'll find that they do things which Victoria knows well, game jams, and definitely speak to the universities and find out, whether they would be interested in collaborating with you.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you. Yeah, I'm so often in my own little bubble that I don't even think about the greater world of those things. So it's always a great reminder that that there are people out there who would love to do this kind of thing. Thank you. Any others? Yes.
I think it's absolutely compelling and fascinating, and I was really interested in this idea of moving it out into a kind of a fantasy realm and what that allows, and then this idea of it as a curiosity builder. So I was interested, even just in the form it is now, how do you end it? Because how do you then bridge it into the building the curiosity back to the fact that it's related to reality?
Yeah, that's a great question. I had definitely been thinking about that early on, and I sort of scoped it out of the actual prototype, because I thought, well, this is like part of an actual program or something, right? Like this is like something that maybe it really would depend on the context that you're playing it in. Is it being played in a classroom? Is it being just downloaded by people? Is it in our museum? Where is the context? Like, what are they going to be doing after? If they're in the museum, maybe they just came out of our permanent exhibit while it's still open, and they're completely exhausted, and they play through it, and then they're just like, my mind's blank, I need to go eat lunch, and they just are done. And then other people might be fully rested, and after the game they're like, okay, now what? And I think that there were some ideas I had about maybe there would be, I didn't really like the idea of doing hyperlinking to websites in the game, but that is a thing you can do. The idea that you're building this, let me go back to one of the screens that actually shows the map. So, you're building this diagram here, which is kind of a visual model of trying to understand different aspects of this history and how things are kind of feeding into each other. Couldn't that be a place where you could have jumping off points or suggestions for, how you could, I thought about our encyclopedia, our Holocaust encyclopedia for the museum's website. Is that something we could point people to? I didn't quite make that bridge in the actual implementation, because I thought, well, would I want to do this in a game? Would I really want a web browser popping up and be like, oh yeah. But I think there might be some way of, there could be in the dramatic conclusion to each chapter could maybe add some kind of follow-up links or something to like a little section of the interface that you could look at later. Because I know that a lot of games that they're trying to sneak in like the factual information somewhere, and they're like, okay, well, we'll have like a bonus menu, and you can access these unlockables, and you can, see pictures and stuff. I'm not sure if that to me is like the ideal way to do it, but it is an interesting design challenge, because when they're in the game, you want them to be focused on the game. You don't want them thinking, oh, well, now I have to. I actually thought, should there be an ARG to this where, oh, you have to go into the encyclopedia and look up some information, but then it's like, how are you going to do that while you're like, have the game open and everything? And so there were just some kind of user experience concerns with that. But I do think it's something where the prototype is presenting things, I think, in a fairly straightforward way, but there could be, I know when I play finished games, there's always like little notes and interesting things in a lot of games that pop up. If there's loading screens where you might see different pieces of information and things like that, that I think there are different ways to kind of sprinkle some of that information. And something I didn't really talk about was that I want to kind of subtly remind the player that, hey, this isn't everything. This is like part of a bigger picture, or hey, this is like one angle of this very complex event. Because again, like we're reducing this history into, in this particular prototype, 11 bullet points, and that is obviously a very drastic reduction. And we don't want people to think that it's like that simple. But it is an interesting question how you kind of integrate those things and how you move beyond that space. But yeah, thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I think the question of longevity for this is really interesting because I think it applies to all digital assets. And what is interesting for me, how our expectation changed. So for example, the idea of subtitling in this film, by now it's sort of expected because we see subtitles in social media the whole time. So our aesthetic has changed. And I was yesterday with the 99-year-old kinder transportee who was watching his own interactive Shaw Foundation testimony. And it was really interesting because he was frustrated with the technology. He thought it wasn't fast enough. He didn't like the look of it. He didn't like his short answers, and it's really interesting. So that even looks in our standard today a bit old-fashioned, the interactive testimony. So I think that's the challenge. How do we, of course we have to archive it, but how do we adapt ourselves to the emerging viewing or to change?
The changing tastes of people as they get older, or as they, our younger people are merging in. Yeah, I mean, that is an interesting thing. I mean, even in the medium of games, there's been a lot of different kind of transformations, especially as the primary spending group has sort of aged. And games, I think in maybe the last, I want to say 15 or so years, they started to do a lot of hand-holding that I think coalesced with smartphone technology. And so you'd have games in these complex 3D environments, and they basically gave you a GPS, and they told you exactly where to go, and you didn't really have to look at your surroundings anymore because you have a line that's just overlaid on your interface, and you can just follow the line, and you don't. And eventually, people were like, "This is kind of taking me out of the experience." And then games started to get really interested in extreme difficulty, and they're like, "What if we just stripped all that away and made it terrifying because of the fact that we're gonna like delete your save game if you die, or something really like masochistic?" And that sounds like something that only like a few totally masochistic people would be into, but it proved to be a pretty successful business model, making things like that, because it added a real tension and real stakes into something that was rapidly becoming so easy and frictionless. And so it speaks to that idea. But I think the preservation conversation of like being asset minded is a really smart way of thinking about it, because you might have to not just make a new technology or implement your assets into a new technology, but you may have to edit or expand or contract things depending on how the tastes change. And it's really important to be aware of the differences that way people that consume information and how that works. Thank you.
It's 10 o'clock.
It's 10 o'clock?
Yeah.
Thank you so much.